Hi, Sophie. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Agatha. Thanks for having me here. Can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah, technology, you never know.
I know.
Thank you for having me. I caught a little bit about Young's messages and just so inspiring. And I definitely relate to some aspects of what she said. So just to give you a little background, yeah, I think you gave quite a nice, really nice summary there, but I started my career actually in research. And I was here in Canada at the time. And about a couple of years of doing research, I felt really a deep calling, a deep yearning to make a difference in social justice. I felt, there were certain imbalances, and I can't describe it beyond the fact that it was a yearning to do something and make a meaningful impact. So I quit my job in Canada and I left actually to volunteer in Africa for a few months. People thought I was a bit crazy because, I was giving up a quite sort of an established role and moved to Malawi, where I started to volunteer for the UN. And it was there that my role sort of grew and, it grew into a position, and I remained in Africa for about 8 years, where I really got to know the context, sunk in around the development aid and got to know about how humanitarian development was done in that context, in that region. And several years later, I actually was promoted to Geneva as a manager. And I thought, great, I've worked hard at this and I still had this deep desire to make a difference. But, when I went to Geneva, I really excited, I was growing as a leader as well, but I got there and I felt really lost, completely, utterly lost in this very hierarchical and, an organization that has its deep roots in the patriarchal institutions. And, it was a bit of a dilemma because I had, on the surface, we're definitely there was good intentions to make the world a better place. But this feeling of we were on the internal bit working in very old archaic methods that were a bit disempowering, to be honest. And I felt I had no voice. I noticed that I felt really disconnected from what I was, supposed to be doing, helping women and children. So I started to, and I think that's when I went into really deep soul searching. I call it, getting really down to the spiritual roots of it all. And at the time, a lot of personal issues were starting to resurface as well, same time. And that's when I started to really write and, in the workplace, started to find my voice and started to speak up a bit more. And I think that's where I really connected to truth speaking and helping women find this personal power that was just infinite, I feel. So that's where I'm at today.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Sophie. So kind of going on off of that as well, you mentioned a little bit about how you kind of gained this sense of speaking up as you progress in the workplace. So I was wondering, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the experiences that actually seeded this notion of the unspeakable and of being unable to speak about certain things from a young age in your life?
Yeah, I think the speaking of the unspeakable for me is really about reclaiming the aspects of ourselves that were in the dark, the aspects of ourselves that we completely neglected. When for me, it was a lot about shame. Aspects of my life that brought me shame were left in the dark. And so when you speak about these things, it starts to lose its power and you regain and you reclaim some power. And I think for me, speaking the unspeakable is really about reclamation of your inner power. And so, when I look back, the reason why I'm so interested in this aspect for women is I've noticed in myself the narratives I had. And, every woman has a different narrative. Some would be narratives of abandonment, others would be about relationships. Mine was about voice and being silenced. And so I started to notice these connections and threads in my life in which I was, well, where did it start? And it's often childhood. And for me, it was when I was 6 years old. I was living in Ethiopia. I was born in Ethiopia. And at the time, my parents, we were going through a very oppressive government in those 80s. And my parents decided to move. And, they were sort of involved in minor activist roles. And, there was a lot of challenges in terms of them possibly being jailed and real challenges. So they made this courageous decision to leave. And at the time, I had a brother who was 4 years old and my sister who was 2, and my adopted sister who was 16 at the time. So when we decided to leave, my parents, it was a dangerous mission to leave together, so they decided to separate. My dad went to Italy and my mother went, my mother went to Italy and my dad went to the US. And they had to kind of make arrangements for us to leave alone, which is such it's a common story where children, migrants who are leaving their countries for a better world. And at the time, I left pretty much everything I knew at the age of 6. I remember saying goodbye to my grandmother in the middle of the night, having to make this journey I have vivid memories of being in a pickup truck, packed way too much, too many people, and just crossing the border into Kenya. And I think this is when that fear of speaking up started to spark, because I was separated from my parents. I didn't know why, for how long. The oldest in our group was my 16-year-old sister, and the youngest was 2 at the time. So, now being a mother, I really commend and look back on the courage that my mother, how scary it must have been to leave her 2-year-old behind. And so, as we crossed into Kenya, the money that my sister had was lost, stolen, and we were left stranded without any money or food. And it turned into 2 months of that. And I have, very vivid memories of just being really afraid of how we're going to get food. We started to get into dehydration and even sneaking into people's backyards to grab some food. And at the time, after about 2 months of very strong networks, my parents started to arrange family networks to get us to the safest point, which was Somalia at the time. And so we finally made it to Somalia. And it was there that I felt, again, another experience of being silenced, in which Ethiopia was at war with Somalia at the time. And I just remember it wasn't safe to speak about who I was, to speak about being Ethiopian. And, I was hiding from Ethiopian soldiers coming in, and that was very confusing, very conflicting. And why am I hiding from my own people? But 2.5 years later, we were actually, UNHCR, who happens to be an UN agency for refugees, helped us to seek asylum in Canada, where we were united. It was, quite an intense time in my life, where I feel that those threads of the narrative of silence really started to strike a chord. This refugee experience, being stripped of identity, and just the fear of speaking up, and the threat and the food insecurities. So it was a few years before I was finally able to stabilize, and when we got to Canada.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's kind of so inspiring as well to see it, at what point you've got now where you can speak kind of so openly about it, and especially I can see in the chat there's so much kind of support, and it's so inspiring, I think, for so many people to also see this is an example of really speaking up and kind of being able to come to terms with your story and your narrative. So I wanted to, you mentioned a little bit as well about your family and how kind of this period was difficult with you, obviously, this period of reuniting with your family. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how this narrative of silence maybe was perpetuated even when you were reunited with your family and kind of in your cultural upbringing, and also whether you kind of noticed this as well to be an issue within broader society. So how you linked your personal story with what you see in broader society as well.
Right. Yeah, I think fear of speaking up is a real problem. For me, it's one of the main challenges and blocks that has been brought about by very, roots in patriarchy. Again, when we look at the sort of the profits and the orientation for gain and just the divide and conquer, those I think come from very deep roots. And so for me, I wasn't surprised that in my culture and upbringing there was a lot of silencing, and it's it's apparent in other cultures as well. But when I connect it to what in my teenage years, another incident which is had a huge ripple effect in terms of my voice and how I showed up, and that was when I was 12. I was living with my family, and my uncle was there. And at the time, between the ages of 12 to 14, there was sexual abuse, and I experienced very, let's say, fearful. I was in terror. I was living in terror. There was nights of where I just didn't know if he was going to come and break down the door, just complete feeling of unsafety. And this went on for about 2 years. And when I confided one day in a friend this was happening in Canada, and I confided in a friend, and I was in high school by then, and she was angry, she told a teacher. That teacher told police, because at the time I was a minor, and there was some laws in Canada about minorities, and that just sort of opened this whole can of worms that I'd never expected. And police showed up at my door one day, and it was just this legal process that started, but without really any control of mine. And at the time, what struck me the most was the feeling of sort of being silenced again, in which, as much as my parents love me, and we've talked about this over time, but it was the reaction that parents and family had, and the wider family, was, this is a bit shameful. We don't want it to get out. Let's just deal with it in-house. And I even had his wife at the time, my uncle's wife, who called me, begging me to drop everything because her children were going to be affected. And looking back, there was such a great burden and a responsibility to not impact these children. And I was a child myself. And so it was, I think, it's very deeply hurtful when your voice is silenced, and the impact that has over time is really that your voice doesn't matter, and that you are a shame, and that you bring shame to the family. So, but in years later, when I started to address that within this kind of soul searching period that I had, I started to notice that this was an intergenerational problem, in which it started to unearth these issues within my family, starting from my mother, who years later, as an adult, I was 38 by then, she told me that she was violently abused at the age of 5, very young, too young to be able to process this. And my adopted sister, now I can see why the two had a deep relationship, who also was multiple times abused before the ages of 10. And this was happening to my younger sister too, at the ages of 8. And, I started to notice that it was just aunts and cousins alike were affected. It went as far as my grandmother, my great grandmother. And so I was struck by this. I cannot let it happen again. I can't let this happen to my daughter. And I noticed in that period as well that my daughter, it was this ironic experience of, sorry, there was this ironic experience of my daughter who was not able to speak and communicate at the time as well. And so I was now faced with this very like symbolic issue of my daughter not being able to speak. And I just wanted her to give her voice. I wanted all of us to speak about it, because leaving this in the dark was just not doing anyone good. And I think what I noticed since then was this huge transformation in my family. You know, I don't, it's not a direct work of what I did, which was breaking my own silence, but I noticed they broke their silence and handled it in different ways, in their own unique ways. And I've gotten the blessing of my mother to talk about this, you know, and my sisters. So I think there's a great power in breaking narratives of silence, and any narrative that you feel is disempowering. For me, it is about speaking the truth and bringing out, you know, what was unspeakable into the light.
I can just see the chat is being flooded so like by so many comments, kind of saying how courageous this account is, and really how speaking up, and as you said, being upfront, is really the only path to freedom, and kind of not speaking up. And in some ways, I think also carrying that burden, as you said, it kind of goes along all your life, and even if you don't realize, it's just affecting you kind of in so many different situations, because you're carrying that along, and even in some ways, you're carrying along like from the past generations, kind of all of that inheritance of burden, and kind of feeling shame, and then and that's not able to be released any other way. So it's so,
yeah, it's not our shame, it's not my shame, so why keep it inside? And you know, I think there's a huge power in speaking these things.
exactly. And I actually think it's so interesting how in some ways in our society the roles are kind of reversed, where the shame is often put on the victims that kind of suffer this abuse, when just to in reality kind of deflect, or in some ways again always put the blame and make the victims feel shameful, and like they are the ones doing something wrong by actually saying something, when
Yeah.
it's obviously quite the contrary. So kind of going off on that as well, on the fact that you noticed that this was really passed intergenerationally within your family, and we did talk a lot about shame and how you think that factor as well contributed to that. But what would be other factors you think that also contributed to the fear of speaking up? And you also mentioned this briefly at first, but how do you think this translates as well into your professional sphere as a leader?
Yeah, I think that there is so many aspects that we can address when it comes to the blocking of speaking up. But for me, it was my relationship to authority, which doesn't make sense, which makes total sense when I look back, because I was in this very hierarchical, patriarchal culture that, you know, it was all about authority. And we talked so much about this in my own family much years later as an adult, on how this translates. My fear of speaking up, speaking to someone that is, let's say, an authority figure, and how this translates into work, how this translates into every bit of being that I am as a woman. We bring that everywhere. And what I started to notice was I started to bring this into my workplace. You know, I remember an incident at one point when I was working as a manager. So, you know, a women leader, and I had a male senior boss who, at the time, I was offered a very interesting project from the executive director's office, and it was, you know, pretty high profile, and he wasn't asked in that. So he, I think, felt a little bit of an ego hit, that he was kind of bypassed in that very hierarchical pecking order, which is the UN, you know, very sort of military-like in a way, in the structure that we have. And in this sort of, he confronted me in a very angry way, and was saying, you know, at the time, media was blowing up with very sensitive reports of power, you know, abuse of power and all these things. And he said, you know, we're in a very sensitive time. How could you just go elsewhere and present these ideas elsewhere? Which I had done because I provided these ideas to his senior because I felt blocked. My voice wasn't heard. I felt that my ideas for this really interesting project was being blocked. And so he got really angry. And I'll never forget the way I responded in that moment, because I perceived him to be this authority figure. And what I said was, and looking back, this is a total mistake, is, I became very honest and said, why, I did that because I'm really like uncomfortable due to my culture to confront someone I feel is a senior to me. And I completely in that moment gave him power. And what he said, I'll never forget, because this was a total shift for me and a transformation. He said, "It's not my problem, you have father issues." And for me, that, first of all, completely inappropriate in a work setting, but sometimes life throws things that you really need to address your way. And that was a turning point for me, because what I realized was, how was I seeking permission to be who I am in the workplace and showing my power? How was I didn't need his permission. And how I became more accountable in that moment into the narrative of silence I had. And I think it's because we have these disempowering narratives that we often give people our power away. And so I really started to reclaim and started to shift. And, I spoke up more, and that situation was a complete turnaround. And I think sometimes these issues are good in a way when you're throwing these challenges.
So, Sophie, when I met you the first time, your smile really touched my heart. And I appreciated so much how you were able to talk about what is perceived almost as a taboo subject. I hope you do realize how unbelievable is the energy and strength you spread in the universe. Of course, courage is the key ingredient to tilt the tip of the iceberg. So what does courage mean to you? And how is your vision of courage maybe different from the traditional vision of what courage is in the West?
Great question. I think courage is about knowing, your courage doesn't mean that there is an absence of fear. In all of this, there is going to be fear when you're trying to show up and do some truth speaking. There is going to be fear. I think it takes a deep conviction. This is something that Jung said as well, that there's this desire to make a change, and there's something bigger than you that is a calling, that you need to see this change, and you're convinced that it's possible, because that gives you the courage to be able to keep on going. But I also think that, yeah, courage for me specifically was around, knowing all the spots in my life that I had held on to that were in the dark, like the shame, and these aspects of bringing it out into the light. That is what gave me courage to just accept all of these aspects that I thought was completely dismissed and disregarded. And that is, I think, for me, what courage is knowing those fears, those dark spots, and doing it anyway because of your convictions.
Thank you so much. And also, I really appreciate kind of what you said about the fact that you don't have to kind of ignore the fear. And in some ways, I feel like also courage or maybe leadership is a lot portrayed in our society as kind of people who are fearless and kind of who are out there and who are invincible. This kind of whole narrative of not being untouchable. And in some ways, it's always good to remind ourselves that obviously that's also just what's on the outside, and you might be feeling something different on the inside, and it's also okay to be feeling that fear or that confusion. It's never going to be easy to do that. I wanted to now shift a little bit our discussion from your experience in breaking these disempowering narratives, and in some ways in confronting your oppressors, or kind of the elements that have made you feel like you haven't been able to speak up. So how have you been able to do this within your own descendants, and what advice would you maybe give to other women, no matter what specific narrative they're trying to break, to do this as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel that what I've done is really try to bring my personal narrative of the silence into my workplace and vice versa, because I've noticed that they're all there. And so what I've started to do was journal, write more, to be able to, even during scary moments, use those as opportunities to just speak up. And I'll tell you an example. I think often some of these, let's say, structures of patriarchal, imposed by these leaders. I'm very interested in the notion of women leaders. And one of the experiences I had when I was working in humanitarian aid is as a manager, I was actually reporting to a women leader. And this happens, I get a lot of questions about what, this sort of authoritative style of leadership. It doesn't just come from the oppressive male figures, it comes also from these women who are perhaps trained in this very patriarchal divide and conquer rule. And I had such a manager in my previous office, and it was very stressful because there was a tendency to completely use fear tactics to kind of just submit and can make you could take control of any situation. And she was using what I consider to be very old traditional patriarchal leadership models. And so at one point I was actually having quite an let's say confrontation about, I felt that she was very unsupportive of gender supportive, flexible working time and work from home, in which our organization had a very strong, clear policy. And I started to notice that there was this really strong, let's say, boundaries and control in a very rigid style. So what I started to do was use the power of women communities. And we started to basically form a group, and it grew in numbers eventually, these women who were sharing their experiences in their other teams of how their managers dealt with gender supportive policies for workplace, and how then we started to join forces with New York and different divisions of headquarters. And what we started to do through this was really just let our voices emerge in a very hierarchical and rigid structure. And what I think happens that's interesting is I used to get the questions, well, you can't really change these narratives, Sophie. This has been an institution for many years. How can you make these changes? But what happens is when you, as whatever so-called followers, start to embrace your power and start to speak up and start to truth speak, it does have a ripple effect. And you start to notice that people are noticing areas of their own lives that, let's say, these very old patriarchal rules have had on them and the impact it's had on them. And so what ended up happening, interestingly enough, we received a message from the executive director, very clear email, strong message saying, from now on, that all managers must approve these gender, flexible working hours for women employees, and that the default answer should be yes. And we weren't sure as a group of women if this was a direct link of the work and the advocacy we were doing, but what I was very clear on is that often in my life, when I start to speak up and do these sort of truth speaking, that my reality starts to reflect what is going on inside.